Is on. Excellent. Fantastic. Okay. So I have a topic for you today that we're going to get into. I don't teach a lot on Apostle Paul, but today I decided I will venture into it. Sometimes I surprise myself, but unity and diversity is a topic that's how I called it, and there's a reason why. I'll tell you why I call it that. Because to me, the entire book of Romans, that's kind of like the topic for it. I want you to realize what happened in the book of Romans. There's a lot of disunity in the book of Romans because Jews planted and established the faith communities in the city of Rome. And then Jews were expelled from the city of Rome. And when they came back to the city of Rome years and years later, the very communities that they have established, which were by that point completely non-Jewish because all the Jews were kicked out of Rome, changed. So, like, imagine if if we had a synagogue here for a little while, and then all of a sudden all the Jews were made illegal in the city of Roswell, and we could not come within so many feet of the city borders, and we were out, and we were done. And the only people that would stay in this building would be non-Jews. And so, 15 years go by, and I come back. What do you think would happen? Would it look anything like what I left? Let's put it that way. And that's a big question. Somewhat. Some things will stay the same. Other things will probably change. But that's kind of what happened in Rome. And that's what I want you to realize. And so when Apostle Paul writes to the Romans, he's trying to settle some difficult angles, some difficult things that have happened in that community. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of dissent. And a lot of hurt feelings, and people are saying things that are unkind to each other, and he's trying to get in between the people and say, look, we don't have to be the same. We can be diverse, but we can exhibit unity. We can get along. And so that's why I call this teaching Unity and Diversity, because to me that's what the entire book of Romans is really all about. That's what it teaches you. It teaches you how to find a place of unity in a place of diversity. Sometimes it's not so comfortable. Because in the end, we like to be around the people who are just like us, right? Because then it's easy, because we know exactly what to expect from them. But then diversity, it throws a kink in. So that's why I called it that, unity and diversity. Good news for Jews, Greeks, and barbarians. By the way, anybody knows who barbarians are? Any barbarians in the room? Barbarians. They're called barbarians because that's exactly what it says. Al goes, I know. Al, barbarians? You're one of them? Is that what you're saying? Arl's a barbarian. He goes, he's a barbarian. Okay. So barbarians are people who go bar, 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 bar. You don't understand what they're saying, basically. So, people whose language sounds unintelligible to you, they're barbarians. But, that's actually a very technical term that Greeks used. That Greeks were Greeks. They were Hellenes. They were people who were Hellenized. They were people who followed the Greek culture, which was like the best, most progressive culture of the day, right? But then there were those who were barbarians, and then there were Jews. Jews weren't considered barbarians because they had a very sophisticated culture of their own, very distinct, educated culture, but just not Greek. So they didn't really know what to do with them, and everybody else Greeks called barbarians, but then Jews, they said, well, we can't really call them barbarians, they're just Jews. So there you go. Anyway, when Paul writes, sometimes he uses these categories of Jews, Greeks, and barbarians. And so you'll see that right there in chapter 1. But let me start by saying a couple of things about Apostle Paul. To say that Apostle Paul has been misunderstood is an understatement. Seriously. For ages, this Pharisee, son of Pharisees, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel himself, the great teacher, the grandson of Hillel, was depicted as an apostate Jew who left Judaism and joined Christianity. So Saul got baptized and became Paul. You heard that one before? You have. You're nodding your heads because you heard this kind of stuff. So for years, this is how people have been looking at this great Jewish apostle. Hopefully you see a problem with that statement. These ideas are kind of laughable today because Christianity did not yet exist. How can Paul How can Saul become Paul and convert to something that's not there yet? There's nothing for Paul to convert to. The only thing that he can convert to is a conviction that Yeshua is the promised Jewish Messiah. To that he can convert. That idea he can embrace. And that would make him strange and different and a minority among his people. But that's what he can convert to. So Paul's only choices of religion, if we're going to be talking about conversion from one religion to another, were Judaism and paganism. That's what it was around. Because Christianity was not an option. So, and for his disciples, by the way, for all his followers, all these people that he writes letters to, those are the only choices as well. They didn't have anything else to go to. It was Judaism or paganism. And they were coming out of paganism. So guess what they were coming into? Right. And they were figuring out their own path. They were figuring out their own little niche, their own little place within this big, broad category that we call Judaism. Because I've been teaching on diversity of different Jewish movements and different groups and sects. And so you probably figured this out, that Judaism is not this monolithic group. There are many kinds of Jews with different ideas. And just because one kind of Jew thinks one way and the other one thinks the other way, it doesn't mean that one of them is a Jew and the other is a non-Jew. They're both Jews, just different. So, an apostle, by the way. People get really confused by this word apostle. Apostolos in Greek, or in Hebrew would say shaliach. Who is a shaliach? Shaliach is like the one who's sent. Okay? So how does our Torah passage begin today? With that same exact word. Shalach. Right, it also says shalach. Shalach means sent. So what is Shaul? Shaul is the sent one. He's the one who was sent, just like all the people were sent to check out the land and investigate it. He is sent. He is an apostle, which really means a sent one. Just the Greek version of that. And he is sent to proclaim. His goal is to proclaim a very transformative truth. Truth to the world. And he calls that truth the gospel. Here's another problematic word, because automatically when people hear the gospel, they think of, Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, right? The robes, gospel music, whatever. It's whatever floods your mind, I have no idea. But when I say the word gospel, Judaism does not come to mind, right? Okay, so this is the problem. Good news. That's what the gospel means. Besorah, or Besorah Tovah. So he's supposed to teach this truth, proclaim this truth, and he's supposed to instruct people after they've heard this truth and encourage anyone who embrace this truth, whether they're Jews, Greeks, or barbarians. That's his goal. That's his calling. That's what it means to be a shaliach, the sent one. He's a messenger. He delivers that message, and then he helps people to live that message out, to figure out how do we live now that we have embraced this idea. So for ages, Paul was touted as a convert to a religion that yet did not exist. And what do you want to wager that his gospel, the good news, was also understood and presented in some twisted shape and manner? I think the odds are pretty high. If we, for so many ages, really twisted who Paul was, we probably have heard some pretty weird and wacky teachings about what this whole gospel is all about. And that's kind of where my job is to come and to challenge and to say, let's read him, and let's read him for what he says, and let's break it down, let's understand it. Let's read him and understand him without all the baggage that a lot of times this commentary may bring. Because people are living in a different world today. They have ideas. I say gospel, they think Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir or something like that. That's what I mean. We got to get out of that mindset. So how is it possible? How is it possible that somebody like that would get all twisted up? How is it possible that this idea of a gospel would somehow be twisted up in something strange? The good news message that the Jewish apostle to the nations proclaimed actually was quite real. It was something very tangible, and it really worked, because in the end, God is the one who's transforming people's lives. The reason why the message works is not the message or the messenger. It's the fact that God is behind those words. That's why it works. This is how prayer works as well. it's not the mental or intellectual assent to some higher way of thinking. We're not talking about philosophy. It's actually the power of the living God working in the lives of human beings that brings freedom and transformation into our lives. That's what gospel is. It's a powerful message that is capable to transform you. It's not something that you just thought up by yourself and say, oh wow, I figured out how to do this equation a different way from the way I was taught in school or something like that. No, that's not what we're talking about. This is not some sort of a mental, intellectual achievement. It's not an enlightenment. It's God coming and changing your life, changing you from the inside out. God is the active ingredient in this situation. How it works, people always ask me, how does it working? Well, the mechanics of how it works remains a mystery. And that's not new. We have that all around. How is it not a mystery that the people of Israel stood at the foot of Sinai and all heard God? How is it not a mystery that he opened the Red Sea before us and we all went through and did not get wet? How is it not a mystery that we wandered in the desert for years and years and years, our shoes didn't wear out, and food was falling from the sky? How is that not a mystery? All of that is a mystery because we actually don't understand how that works. But we accept these things, and so why would it be difficult for us to accept that God does some other things that we don't really understand how they work? We just know how it works. And we don't know how it works, we know that it works. I always tell people like that. Now, I'm not very mechanical, I'm not very good with cars. I don't fully understand how everything in the car works. I just know that when I get in and I crank it, it drives, right? But if you ask me to take it apart, put it together, or what parts are responsible for what, I will know the big things. But a lot of those little hoses and gizmos, I will say I have no idea what they do. So only big picture. And so you don't have to actually understand how it works in order for you to recognize that, hey, it does work and it gets it done. So many people believe that in the first century, Jews rejected Yeshua as God's messenger. And Paul, having exhausted his options in the synagogues, went to preach to the Gentiles as plan B. You heard that before? Oh, come on, you've heard this. I'm getting into Romans. I got to lay the foundation. That is not what happened exactly, by the way, if that's what you heard. They're like, okay, the Jews are not listening to me, so I guess I'm going to Gentiles. Plan B. That's not what happened. So how did it happen? What was really going on? Paul is known as the apostle to the nations. He's known as the apostle of Gentiles because of the strategic mission that he received. And he obeyed. He was actually told to go. He was sent. That's the whole idea of being a shaliach, an apostle. Prior to the first century, the nations were not ready to embrace the Jewish message of one invisible God who rules over everything. You realize Jews have been believing that for ages? One invisible God who rules everything. And what did the nations believe? Many, many gods who rule tiny little domains, you know. You want rain, you pray to this God. You want harvest, you want pray to this God. You want good harvest of grapes, you pray to that God because he's in charge of the harvest of grapes. So on and so forth. So this was the message, but they were not ready for it. For a long, long time, the nations of the world found absolutely no reverberation of this Jewish message of one invisible God who rules all things. Yet suddenly, the nations were disappointed in their gods and ready to hear an alternative view of the world. That's what happened in this time, in that era, in Paul's day. Suddenly, the spirituality of the tiny people group threatened the mighty Roman Empire so much that they officially suppressed it. What happened? A bunch of bearded, shepherd-looking people wandering the countryside who have their strange religion and squiggly letters, who believe in coming of the Messiah, all these kinds of things, somehow that they are a threat to the mighty Roman Empire? Yeah, that's what happened. That's what happened. Why? Because Judaism brings beliefs that kind of undermine the whole entire Roman way of thinking, their way of life. So yes, they're going to be suppressed. And Paul is one of those agitators who goes around telling people that, hey, there's one God, not many. For ages, empire after empire would trample Israel underfoot as God called Israel to covenant fidelity. Remember, God is saying to Israel, repent, repent. If you don't, I'm going to send the nations upon you. And then they come. But now, the nations of the world, united under Hellenism, all speaking the same language, they were paying attention to Israel's message all of a sudden. You and I don't control these things, but these things sometimes happen. Sometimes people just stop listening or begin listening. And it's not what you and I are saying or not saying. It's just something that happens. And so it happened in that moment in history that the Gentile world, the Hellenistic world, all of a sudden was paying attention to this Jewish message of monotheism. And non-Jews were coming to synagogues and listening to that message and hearing those words and trying to understand the words of Moses as it was taught in Hebrew and, of course, translated into Greek all throughout diaspora. And they looked to those words, and some of them came closer. So Paul, he writes this letter, and I've talked about him writing a letter and the reason why he wrote it. He wrote this long letter to his followers, to the followers of Christ in Rome, explaining himself quite a bit and explaining his gospel quite a bit. So I think to remedy the misunderstanding of Paul, the best way to do is to reread him and to allow ourselves the openness of mind to rethink some of the things that he said. I'm hoping you're up for that challenge with me as we do this today, just a little bit. So I'm going to get into first chapter. Romans chapter 1. I'm skipping the introduction, the greetings and all that stuff, and jump into the meat of it. Verses 13 through 15. He writes to Romans. Mostly his audience is non-Jewish. So he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren. There, right away, there's a word that can possibly take us off course. The word brethren. You know, people are familiar with religious orders like monks and nuns and brother so-and-so and sister and so-and-so, and they call each other that. I just want you to realize in a Hellenistic world, this is how people express camaraderie. They just said adelphoi. Adelphoi is the collective word where it means brothers and sisters. And by the way, disciples talk like that too. In the book of Acts, that's what Peter does. He says, brothers, sisters, men of Israel. You know, that's how he addresses them. Why? Because he's actually speaking to his relatives. Like, he's connecting with them on a personal level. So he says, I don't want you to be unaware, brethren. And that's just a general term of calling them to camaraderie. Because, we're in this together. That often I have planned to come to you, meaning I wanted to visit, and have been prevented so far. Why was he prevented? Well, because he was in jail. Because they got him and they put him in jail because they didn't want him to come to Rome or anything like that. If he was going to come to Rome, he was going to come to Rome in chains. So that I may obtain some fruit among you also. What in the world is he talking about? He's interested in the fruit basket? I want to obtain some fruits. Do they have some fruit in Rome? No, what he's saying is that I am looking for you as a people to be the fruits that I can present to God as an offering. The fruits of my labor, the fruits of what I teach. He's a teacher, okay? He's an educator. His job is to help people understand this wonderful, amazing message that God is now spreading across the world. And he says, I want to have some fruit among you too. Because I had fruit in other places, but not with you. See, Paul did not really have an effect on Roman community, not directly. He didn't come there and establish those communities of faith like he did in some other places. So he says, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. So you know who he's writing, not to Jews, but to Gentiles. So he says, among the rest of the Gentiles, I had some fruit. I have planted some seeds. They were watered. They grew. They gave forth fruit. And I am rejoicing that now these people are walking with God. They walked away from their idols. And I can rejoice the fact that I actually changed somebody's life. This is amazing. Why? Because I was obedient to do what God told me to do. So that's to him the proof that it's working. So he writes in verse 14, I am under obligation to both to Greeks and to barbarians, both the wise and to the foolish. So that phrase right there, under obligation, that tells you why he's actually doing it. He feels absolutely obligated. And the language right there, if I was to look into Greek, it's the language of a debtor. It's like I have an obligation as if I owe a debt. It's almost like a financial transaction language. I am obligated to pay my credit card bill, right? Why? Because I signed that contract. So here it is. I'm under obligation to go to the Greeks, barbarians. So Greeks are the educated, Greek-speaking people, not just Greeks who live in Greece. But they're all over the place. And barbarians, well, they're the ones whose language we don't understand. They have strange ways. They don't follow the Hellenistic culture, essentially. These are the people that hold on to their strange ways and dance around the fire dressed in animal skins or something like that. That's what we're talking about. So remember, Greeks, they were trying to civilize a lot of barbarians, but they didn't really succeed very well. So he says, I'm obligated to the wise and to the foolish. So now you get the idea. That's what we call Hebrew parallelism. You have word, word, phrase, phrase, term, term, and they repeat each other. So the Greeks are the wise and the barbarians are foolish, if you haven't figured this out. It's parallelism. So he says, for on my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. And there we run into another possible obstacle word, preach the gospel. When I say preach the gospel, I have no idea what's going on in your mind. I could possibly imagine you visualizing the picture of Billy Graham crusade. Because he is preaching the gospel, right? That's not what it was like, honestly. Because remember, none of that existed yet. This is Apostle Paul writing in the first century. There were no crusades yet. And the crusades that did come were Muslim crusades for the most part and things like that. So let's get that out of the way. What he's trying to say is, I am eager to proclaim the good news to you who are in Rome. So I haven't done that to you who are in Rome. I've done it to other Gentiles, and it worked. And I had some fruit. But to you who are in Rome, I didn't have a chance to do that. So he says, I'm eager to do that. I want to do this. But he's in jail, so he can't get out. So then comes a real powerful statement right there. Romans 1:16 through 17. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Okay, this is the good news. That's what the gospel means. I'm not ashamed of the good news, for it, this gospel, is the power of God for salvation. To everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, that is the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And faith is that word that could mean faithfulness, fidelity, trustworthiness. That's kind of the idea. As it is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. I love it when Paul gives me a little bit of a help of understanding his terminology, what he means. Because right there, he just quotes prophet Habakkuk, word for word. Habakkuk 2:4 says, V'tzadik be'emunato yeh, which translates, the righteous by his faith will live. That's what it means, or by his faithfulness. So what he's really saying here is he's talking about pistis in Greek, faith, or emunah in Hebrew. If you understand the concept of emunah, it is trust, it is reliance, it is, we call faith, but not faith as in religion. It's more like faith as an act of trusting. An action is actually involved in that word emunah. So he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Whatever that gospel yet means, maybe we don't fully understand what that means, but he does say it is the power of God to salvation. That's very significant, and righteousness of God is being revealed. So what can we take of it? What is this gospel? What is this good news? It is exactly what it sounds like. Good news is good news. A dangerous and potentially disastrous situation has turned into something good. That's what good news is. Good news is you don't owe that interest on that credit card. Good news is, whatever. The accident you were in, the insurance decided to pay you 2 times the amount of money that, your car costs or something like that. That's good news. So for his own reasons, God reversed whatever disastrous situation might have been. That's what good news is. That's good news, right? In 2 Kings chapter 7, there's a story that I want to remind you about. We read the story about the siege of the city of Samaria. So this is northern Israel. And the enemies, they thought, as they surrounded the city, they thought that they heard the sounds of Egyptian and Hittite chariots advancing. So they ran and they abandoned their camp. Literally. They surrounded Samaria. They think, okay, that's it. We're just going to starve them out and take them over. And then God comes and plants it into their minds that the enemy is coming. And they start hearing the sounds of chariots. And they run. They're thinking, okay, The king of Samaria must have hired the Hittites and the Egyptians to come after us. He paid the mercenaries, so we're getting out of their way. We don't get killed. So they ran out. And then the story continues is that there's two lepers walking around, and they're starving to death, and they're thinking, well, should we sneak into the city? Because they have no food. You're not supposed to go into the city. I'm a leper, right? Should we sneak into the city? And if I go into the city and they have no food, so we starve and we die. Should we try to go to the camp of the enemy? Because they might want to kill us, so we die anyway. But what if they have food and they're kind to us and they give us some food and we survive? So they say, you know what? We're going to go to the camp of the enemy. So they go to the camp of the enemy, and what do they find? An empty camp. Everyone is gone. They go into the first tent. Hey, there's food. They eat, and they find some money. They find some gold. They're like, oh, yeah. So they go and they stash it. They bury it. They go into the second tent. More food, more gold. They stash that. And they're kind of doing that for a little while until they come to a realization. They said to one another, it says, we're not doing right. This day is the day of good news. Look at this. Yom Zeh, Yom Besorah. This day is the day of good news. But we're keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, the punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. What is the good news? The enemy are gone. You're sitting in the city with locked doors, thinking these guys are coming after you, and the camp has been abandoned. The enemy is gone. And they left all their stuff behind because they ran in a hurry, so you can actually come out and take their stuff. And that's what they've been doing, but they've been keeping it all to themselves. So they say, no, wait a minute. We can't do that. Their conscience kicked in. They're like, no, we need to let the people in the city know there's no reason to stay behind the walls and keep starving. This is the day. This is the day of the good news. So what is good news? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's good news. It means something has changed. That a potentially disastrous situation has turned into something good. And you're supposed to benefit from it. God reversed it. That's really what good news in Paul means, by the way, too. The good news, the gospel that Paul proclaims to everyone, he says it's a power of God unto salvation. That's a tough one to understand because now we're running into yet another term. We don't have no idea what that means because remember, you're reading Paul for the very first time. You have no idea what he says. Salvation from what? What is he talking about? Rescue from whom? What does he mean? That kind of needs to be explained. We just read that verse. And remember, you're reading with a blank mind. You have no idea. None of that context exists for you yet. You're trying to understand Paul in context. It's not clear. He doesn't tell you what it is. That needs to be explained. So maybe the answer will come a little bit later, right? So we'll just keep reading. So this empowerment, right? It is the power of God. And we're talking about something that's empowerment, something that's a strength that leads to salvation from whatever, we don't know yet, requires belief. It requires trust. It requires emunah. First and foremost, it requires it from Jews, but then somehow it should also appeal to non-Jews, meaning to the Hellenized nations as well. That's a very interesting description of what Paul is saying the good news is. Somehow, God's own righteousness also is revealed in that good news. So it's a bit of a complicated definition that he gives us so far. We got to unravel it to understand a little better, but we don't know what good news generally means. But how does he mean it, and what does he mean by all this righteousness and salvation, all these religious words? So let's keep reading. Let's see if we can unravel it. Romans 1:18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them that for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So let's pause here for a second. What's going on? The wrath of God is revealed. So the righteousness of God is revealed, but also the wrath of God is revealed. The righteousness of God is connected to this good news gospel, but the wrath of God is somehow connected to ungodliness and its unrighteous men who suppress the truth? That makes somewhat sense. Let's think about it. What is going on here? I see also that there's understanding of who God is through what has been made. So we have to answer some questions. What are these verses saying? What I want you to notice right away is that besides God's own righteousness, there's this God's wrath that is revealed. And this is important. This is a parallelism. God's righteousness is revealed. God's wrath is revealed. Is that what salvation could be for? Because we talked about being saved and salvation. Like, could salvation have something to do with the fact that God is angry? Do we need to be rescued from God's wrath that is also now being revealed? Because we don't have to worry about God's righteousness being revealed. That's a good thing, right? But God's wrath is being revealed. Maybe that we need to be rescued from? So let's keep thinking. The unrighteousness of men, we have the righteousness of God paralleled with the unrighteousness of men, and their suppression of truth. Well, that's what causes God's wrath. They're suppressing the truth. Why is God angered? What is being hidden? What is being suppressed? Paul will tell you straight out. He actually tells you. God's invisible attributes, his nature, they can be seen throughout all creation. God has made this world so that we can look at this world and actually see God in the way the world is made. And this is being evident, yet it is being suppressed. So tell me, how do you suppress such a truth that God is evident and can be seen? What would you have to do to hide that from people? What is the best way to suppress something?
Don't share it. Tell them there's nothing but material world.
Yeah.
Lie.
Thank you. So if I want to suppress the truth, I will tell you an alternative truth. I will feed you a lie. And by doing so, I will hide the truth from you. In fact, I'll make the lie elaborate. In fact, I'll make the lie attractive. I'll make the lie better than the truth that I've got. In some ways, shapes, and forms, appealing to you. So if I lie to you just in the right way, you might just say, whatever it is that I'm seeing, that's not important. It's not real. This is real. This is the real world. This is how things really are. So what God's wrath is about in these verses is the fact that he's angered that there are God's attributes is revealed in his creation, yet people are being held back. This is being hidden from them. It's being concealed from them. The truth is being suppressed, and the only way it could be suppressed is through the alternatives, like I said. So guess what? He's going to talk about these alternatives. So he continues talking about them, and he talks about mankind, and he talks about unrighteous people. Verse 21 through 23, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or gave thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. This is when the Jews go, ew, right? Like, this is what happened. Think about it. He's actually putting an indictment out there. So we have this truth of God, which is self-evident in creation, and people suppress this truth by giving you what? By not acknowledging not God that is, but instead of having speculations and foolish ideas and exchanging the glory of God as incorruptible, that means something that cannot be changed or affected in any way. We're talking about an invisible God of Israel, and they're changing it for an image and the form of a corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures and things like that. So some of you, yeah, go ahead, Ralph.
Rabbi, could it be that where the verse says, professing to be wise, could it also be accurate to say, professing to be Greeks, they became fools?
Pretty much. I mean, you remember, he called them the wise.
Right.
There's the wise, the Greeks, and there's the foolish, they're barbarians.
Saying that, underhanded way.
You are catching on to the parallelism in Paul. Paul is very poetic, and Hebrew poetry works in parallels. It's like strings on a guitar. It's like you strike them in the right way, and they all resound together. It's beautiful.
Going back to the example you gave in Kings, I just was noticing that he used lepers. Mm-hmm. He used unlikely. He didn't use the watchmen. He didn't use anybody great or anything. He used
desperate people who were starving. That's what he used.
Fishermen. He used lepers. So
yeah, very very unlikely people, but they're the ones who were delivering the good news to the king, that the enemy army is gone. You come out of the city. So I want you to see something that's going on over here. There's an exchange. The exchange of a real God for images, for forms, for corruptible things, for four-footed animals and crawling creatures. We're talking about idolatry. So the front screen that I started with is this kind of a dark picture of this cave with a little bit of light shining into it. I'm always tempted to tell the story of Plato's allegory of the cave. I don't know if you've heard of Plato's allegory of the cave, but if you haven't, I suggest read it. It's a great, great allegory. So Plato is retelling a story of his teacher Aristotle, who is teaching his disciple. And in his disciples, he tells this story, this allegory, which meant to be an illustration. An illustration is this. There are slaves, they're prisoners who grew up in a cave. And they're sitting in a cave, and all they can see is a wall in front of them. Okay? They can't see the light. The light is behind them. In fact, behind them is a fire burning. And there are people walking behind them and holding up all kinds of images. So when they hold up an image or a shape, they see a shape reflected on the wall. That's all they think. So they've never seen a horse in their life, but they know what the horse looks like by a shape that reflects. They've never seen a jar in their life, but they carry a jar and they see the shape of a jar. Like whatever items that they see, they don't actually see those items. They see forms of those items. Reflections on the wall. And so they spend their entire life like that. And so I'm not going to go through the whole allegory. If you're interested in Plato's allegory of the cave, read it or listen to it on YouTube, whichever your preferred way of learning. There's lots of great storytellers out there. The whole point is that prisoners need to come out of the cave. And that we, human beings, in many ways, are like those prisoners. We don't get to see things how they really are. That there's a world behind this world. That there's something that we cannot see. We see these shadows and we see these shapes, but we have never actually seen that item. We've never experienced it because we're precluded from the light. And so what getting out of the cave would do is would give us that fullness of life, right? We would actually experience the very items, not just the forms or the shapes or the images that are reflected on the wall behind us. That's what we're talking about, idolatry, things like that. People not able to see real God, but seeing creatures, seeing creation, the reflections of God, things that he has made, and they're saying, oh, that is God. So they start worshiping that. That's why the anger of God comes. That's why the wrath is coming. That's the bad news. But as I said, there's the good news, and the good news is the gospel. That God has somehow miraculously reversing this situation. Like I told you, there's the good news, and that's the good news. So when Paul is talking about his good news, that's what he means. So is Paul saying that the good news that he is spreading is able to bring about salvation from God's wrath? That is what I think he's implying. This good news contravenes the attempts to hide the truth and reveals God's own righteousness, if people believe it. If people believe what Paul is saying, if people believe his message, his big idea that he wants to share with the world, then they will come out of the cave. They will stop seeing the creatures and worshiping them and realize that there's one true, real, invisible God. That's the gospel that is transforming the Hellenistic world in the days of Paul. That's what I want you to understand. And that gospel should make sense to Jews as well. The rest of this chapter, Romans chapter 1, I'm not going to read this because it's actually long, so it explains that God in his anger allowed those who choose to worship creatures over the Creator to have their cravings and to have their passions. Basically, God let them have it. You want this stuff? Choke on it. That's what he tells them. Greed, evil, envy, murder. It filled people's lives because that's what they wanted. Women desired women. Men burned with passion for men. That's what Paul says. And it says, and this is something very unnatural, and this is what's something that most of us would like to be saved from. Rescued from the suffering and dying in our own foolishness and delusions. Think about it. If anything we need to be saved from is from our own stupidity and delusions in which we are stuck. Somebody, please come, cut these chains and take me out of the cave and show me the light and show me the real things. Because all I've been seeing are a bunch of reflections on the wall. And I think that's life. I think that's reality because that's all I have ever seen in my life. And somebody is holding me captive and will not let me out. And the truth is out there. So God is angry. God is angry at people who created a system and perpetrate the system that is destroying people's lives, bringing them into the lifestyle that will destroy them completely as a people. Nothing good will come out of that. And so out comes the gospel. And that's what Paul says is the power of God unto salvation. You can be saved. You can be rescued from this. But you have to believe in the gospel. You have to believe the kinds of things that he's talking about. So this is him writing to Romans again, speaking his own language a little bit. So we have to translate Paul into what we have to perceive that he's trying to say. How is it possible that Apostle Paul was so misunderstood? I mean, you heard interpretations of Romans 1. And the questions I have to ask you is, have you heard this interpretation of Romans 1 before? Because if you haven't, my question is, how is it possible that all of you bright, intelligent people have heard Romans before, probably read Romans before, didn't see what I just shared with you? I don't know. There are many reasons, probably. Like I said, remember Plato's allegory of the cave, and that may give you an idea why. People can become very confused and very misled. People can see things and not realize what they actually are seeing, mistaking shadows for the things that cast them. That is a human weakness we have. What we don't know, we don't know. God revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to Moses, to Joshua, to David, and countless others, leading Israel out of the cave of idolatry, out of mistaking creatures for creator, and out of worshiping shadows. This is what God has done with Israel. Think of the Exodus story. Think of everything that we experience in the wilderness as we read the book of Bamidbar, as we experience these passages in the Torah. Is God not cleaning out all that idolatry and false belief out of people's lives? That's exactly what he's doing. That's what Torah is all about. I could say Torah is the gospel. I can, because that's what they had. That's what Moses, David, Joshua, and others had. They had it. But the world did not have it. Because God came to them. God came to those bunch of weird-looking people in the wilderness. He spoke to them. But he didn't go to the whole world because they were not ready to receive it anyway. Well, he tried. They were not ready. There were instances in people's history when God tried to reach out to the world in many different ways, yet people were not ready to accept that. They would rather exchange the truth for a lie. So this is the breakdown. So the wrath of God, the righteousness of God. The good news, but there's also the bad news out there. So good news presupposes there's bad news.
So Paul, I can't remember the chapter, but he also says that we all share in that original sin of Adam, right? So we need that redemption, we need that salvation from that sin. Is that part of this?
We'll talk about it a little bit more. There's a certain aspect of fallenness to human nature. There's an aspect of us not being able to see. There's aspects of us being fooled, obviously. That we need enlightenment. We need some source. We need some means to see the truth. Somebody has to show it to us. Now, we can't see it through nature, as Paul is saying. You could see the creation and see enough to know that no, this frog that people worship did not create the world. Right? come on, let's just be real. I mean, it's a creature, not a creator. There's so many stories that I can tell you from native cultures that really talk about this sky god and how they really doubt anything that's tangible that can't be worshipped. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I remember listening to a Wonder Israel podcast, and the man was talking about how Gamaliel, right, he was a disciple of him. How, like, if 1,000 students applied to be his, disciple or whatever, like, one would be picked. So
Right.
Paul was a genius, and we're not.
Right.
But we dumb down what he's saying instead of trying to figure it out. So I think that's a big thing.
Paul is also a good writer. He's also a very good communicator. And even though he's hard to understand because he's 2,000 years removed from us, that basically we don't speak the kind of language that he speaks. So he has a different reference points in his world. But he's also a very good communicator. And if you pay attention to the structure of what he's saying, you could see the parallelism. You could see the righteousness with unrighteousness. You could see wrath. You could see these, the foolish and the wise. Everything is structured very beautifully. He does not waste words. He says what he says in a very purposeful way, especially when he writes them. I mean, that's how it is. So yeah, definitely he's a smart guy, no question about it. And our challenge is to understand what is it he said. But our challenge is also to step into the shoes of the audience that's listening to him. And right now you have to pretend that you're a bunch of Romans sitting around listening to him, which I'd realize that could be a little bit of a stretch, but let's try. Let's try. Let's pretend we don't know anything. Let's pretend that we're hearing these things for the first time and don't really have all this background understanding, and we haven't read all these theological books. That's kind of like where we have to be in order to hear him in the right way, and not to the prism of everything that we already know and the ideas that we have already built on top of other ideas. That's hard. I mean, scientists do this all the time. They set aside their presuppositions, and that's how discoveries are achieved, is when we take their presuppositions and we move them out of the way. So that's kind of what I'm asking you guys to do sometimes. That's challenging, but it can be done. We can try, right? So that's why I showed you the picture of the cave. Now, hopefully it makes sense. It's an allegory, it's a metaphor, and I use it as an illustration, and Plato uses it as an illustration, but I think it speaks to us. Of course, the way it's used in Greek philosophy is a little bit different than how I put it to you, but just take it for what it is. It's a story. It's a story that is meant to help us see something we don't always think about in a more abstract way. So hopefully this is a new look on the book of Romans. I didn't go into the details of the last part because there's a lot of nasty things that are being mentioned, and I don't want to get stuck in discussing that. We get the idea. God gives them over to all kinds of foolishness, and he lets them have it. And anybody who doesn't want to be saved from that, well, deserves to, I guess, be mired in it. But that's the good news, is that we have an option to come out of that stuff. Yes, ma'am.
Are we going to go through the rest of the book too?
Eventually, yeah. I skip and hop. I will do Romans for a little while, then I'll move to another topic, then I'll come back to Romans again. But hopefully I'll be doing some more Romans, yes. You like Romans?
More good news stuff?
Yeah, of course, yeah, more good news. Because the good news in Romans is all over. You like Romans? Yeah. Paul is a very complicated gentleman, let's put it that way. A brilliant Jew, but not so easy to understand. So some passages will take a lot of unraveling. Other passages will be a little easier. So we'll keep thinking through Romans together. And in doing that, we will hit a lot of very unusual and interesting topics. So how about that? Well, something to look forward to. Okay? Yes.
Could I just say this? Peter has said that Paul is difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, could it be that he said that maybe because Peter is an unlearned man? He's a fisherman. He works with his hands. He works with his body. Paul, on the other hand, has received probably the highest of elite education by Gamaliel himself. And is that maybe the tension between why Peter said Paul is difficult to understand?
Yeah, so they come from different worlds. I mean, you have to understand. Peter is a business owner, a very successful businessman. He doesn't have just one boat. He has a lot of boats. He has a whole fleet of boats, okay? And all his family's working for it. It's a big family business. He's a wealthy businessman. Why? We know that because his mother-in-law has a house right across from the synagogue. You know, that's like having a house across from a governor's mansion. Can you afford that? You know, like, yeah, maybe, but you got to be pretty successful. So, you know, we know he's successful, but probably not super educated, not like Paul, because Paul grew up in Tarsus, and so that would be like in Syria, and so he was educated in Hellenistic culture as well. Knew Greek well, all these languages and cultures that he experienced there, and then he comes to Jerusalem to study Judaism, right? So he actually got both worlds. So it's amazing. It's like a person with a yeshiva education, but a person with a secular education too. So he understands the Greek poets, and he understands the great rabbis. That makes him unique, right?
Good choice for God to send to the Gentiles.
Good choice for God to send to the Gentiles. So he had some training. He understood, actually. You know, when Paul went to speak to the Galatians, he actually knew what Galatians were into. He knew what they believed because he didn't grow up that far from them. He knew their culture. And so, yeah, a good choice. But also, you know, he has this two sides of knowledge. Peter doesn't have that. He's a Galilean. He's a man of commerce and business. Certainly shrewd, certainly capable, but probably not as educated. When Peter and some of the apostles spoke in the book of Acts, and some of the elites heard them speak, they said, oh, these are uneducated men speaking. Which may have actually something to do with their accent too, because all of them Galileans, they spoke with a country bumpkin accent. Galilean accent was not considered to be an educated accent.
A lot of people read that and think, oh, they said they were uneducated and they think they were illiterate. That's not true.
No, they're not illiterate.
Two different things.
They were taking to learn their bar mitzvah. They knew to a point.
They were certainly they had enough education to know what's what. They simply did not sound very sophisticated to people who were very sophisticated and knew all the buzzwords, okay? You know, if I walk into an area that I know nothing about, let's say political science, if I was asked to teach a class on political science, the students will probably laugh me out of the room. Why? Because while I know the basic things, there's a lot of buzzwords I don't understand. It's just not my area, okay? Give me my area and I'm okay, but put me outside of my comfort zone, be difficult. They were not yeshiva bochers. That's the idea. They didn't know the speech. They didn't know the lingo. They did not speak what the elites expected them to speak because they didn't go to the same school. Okay? They didn't have the sorority letters, right? So that's the idea. Okay. So that's hopefully something to look forward to. Great feedback. Appreciate it.